Yes, so this is going to be very informal and wonderful. Thank you all for being here. And I have lots of questions for Jeff, who decided that instead of giving a prepared talk, he would be very brave and just see what I threw at him. But you all can ask questions anytime. So just put your hand up and we'll do that.
Or shout.
Or shout. Yeah, yeah. That's it. With a small group. It's wonderful. So I'm going to give you a one sentence about Jeff, and then I'm going to read a paragraph from his book that I think does a better job of introducing him. Um, Jeff Korzenik is an author, a speaker, an economic explorer, chief investment strategist for one of the country's largest commercial banks. And here's the paragraph that I pulled from his wonderful book, Untapped Talent. On a societal level, this is the right thing to do, one of the most important ways businesses can engage in solving social problems. When people who have made a mistake and paid for that error continue to suffer the penalty of workforce barriers, we create injustice, reduced public safety, family dysfunction, and intergenerational poverty. As a country, we cannot hope to get to equality of opportunity across racial lines until we offer people the opportunity to move beyond their worst moment. Second chance hiring is the solution. The road to a better society must be paved by the business community, and untapped talent is the map. So I think that gets us started. So I thought it would be interesting just to sort of find out how you got started in this particular area.
I really have two answers for that. I like to say I started professionally because about a decade ago, there was a big question among economists as to why so many people were sidelined out of the labor force, and particularly young men. And it had become such a big issue that it was slowing our growth in the economy. And now we see it today as a really severe labor shortage. And I came to understand through research that we were missing people because of social ills. I focused first on the opioid epidemic, which has taken a terrible, terrible toll, not just the 100,000 overdose deaths we had last year, but HHS estimates that over 10 million Americans are taking opioids for non-medicinal purposes. So that's a workforce issue. And then I moved on and saw that justice involvement. Having a criminal record is just a devastating barrier to being a participant in the economy, but it became all of our issue because we need workers. We feel it today, but even before we felt it, it was part of the equation for growth. The second quick answer is I think I was prepped for this. I was raised in Hartford. My dad was a son of immigrants, very impoverished, not terrific father, and but he never lost touch with his roots. He went to Harvard and Harvard Law School and has an LLM from Yale and all of those sorts of things. But he would go do errands, what he called errands, and I would accompany him, and he'd go to. I ultimately realized he never actually did anything other than visit people in rough neighborhoods of Hartford. And he was visiting, and he introduced me to a friend of his who ran, I think, a junk shop. I was 10 years old, maybe, and as we walked away from a nice conversation, he said, "You know, my friend was in prison." And I said, "For what?" He said, "For murder, a crime of passion." And then my dad said something that stuck with me. Here we are half a century later. He said, "He's done his time." And so there is a moral basis. I don't really talk about the moral basis in the book. I talk about the business case, right. But there's a moral underpinning for that I learned from my dad.
Yeah. What a great way to jump in. Good. So today I had a wonderful sort of surprise, which was a friend of my daughter's has been an educator in the prison system for the last 8 years, Rikers and Sing Sing. And I managed to get a hold of her, and I told her I was interviewing Jeff. So I said, "What should I ask you?" So one of her questions was, because she sees this as an educator, is that so many of the people that she sees who are incarcerated are way behind in terms of technology. So she said, "You need to ask Jeff. How could companies get people up to date with technology?"
This has been a huge issue. You start with the average person, and people aren't about averages, but it's a starting point for understanding the problems we face. The average level of educational attainment among people who are incarcerated is well below the societal average. And you compound that with most prisons, it's starting to change, don't allow access to the internet. They don't allow access to technology. Some people were incarcerated before the advent of smartphones or PCs, and it's been a long haul. That is changing, fortunately. I visited a prison in Michigan where people were using tablets. They were doing CNC machining, advanced machinery, but instead of having a direct connection, they would program it on a flash drive and give it to one of the supervisory staff to load in. So you're increasingly seeing tablets in prisons. You're seeing the tech industry is very belatedly starting to get involved in training in prison. There's a wonderful nonprofit that's based in Silicon Valley called The Last Mile, which not only does trains people to be software engineers. They have in one of the California state prisons, they have a website creation shop.
Wow.
And so you can commission your website using people who are incarcerated as part of their training.
Wow.
So we're getting there.
Yeah.
But it's a great question.
Yeah. Another question she came up with was, she said, most of the people she's met and taught had experienced a lot of trauma before they ended up in prison, then more trauma being in prison. And she used this phrase, trauma-informed care.
Yes.
And so I asked her, well, what's that? And you probably know better than I do. I don't know what it is, but she's just said that requires a different kind of treatment of not just, well, we're looking at your paperwork. Okay, here's your security check, and you failed it. But really trying to understand people, how they ended up where they were and where they are now, right?
I never excuse the crime, and I have deep sympathy for victims. I've been the victim of property crime, I've been the victim of violent crime. But that being said, the more you have exposure to this population, you come to realize that they are victims themselves very often. Child abuse in various forms, just the trauma of living in dangerous neighborhoods, and what that might mean. We're seeing a movement in the business community, particularly post-COVID, to being much more sensitive to mental health issues. And I'm actually working with a group in Chicago. It's a nonprofit business group that is focused first on trauma-informed care, educating supervisors, and having referral programs to help with these things. And now they're actually focused on second chances. So you do have to, there's a lot of work that people have to do on themselves often before they can be job ready. And that's typically the role of nonprofits. And one of the reasons that I focus on businesses shouldn't try to do this on their own, but need to partner with nonprofits that are going to be more informed and have more experience in this area.
Yeah. And what would you say, Jeff, is employers' sort of number one fear in all this? What is the thing that makes them go, yeah,
The unknown, right? And right, we all hear felony, and you think the worst possible thing,
right?
And that's sometimes is the case, but it rarely is. So employers fear, they have three major fears, but the first one is safety and accompanying liability. Right? Is something going to go wrong where your new second chance employee harms another employee or harms a customer, and you have additional legal liability potentially because you hired someone with a criminal record. So that's a big one and has to be addressed. Second one tends to be a quality concern. There's a widespread belief that people who have criminal records are not capable of quality work, and that's one that you also have to address, but is frankly easier to address because there's so many good examples of great employees come with a background. And the last one tends to be reputation. Is it going to hurt my business? And I think that's kind of an old-fashioned one today. You see, particularly among millennials and Gen Z, they want to do business and they want to work for companies that are somehow engaged in social good. And it's hard to get more social good than taking people who have come from prisons or criminal arrests and helping them be contributing members of society.
Right. Anytime you guys have questions.
Right.
Yeah.
I actually have a lot of questions. Great, thank
Yeah.
you. I guess what is the first one is, what would have been the most surprising skill that people who had this incarceration have brought forward? Because I do think that specifically at this point in time, when so many people were having, and I don't mean to use a right parallel, but the experience of being isolated, of having to rely on working and communicating and creating their own environment because of COVID, this is a population that is already managed.
Yeah, right, and that's kind of the heart of it. You have to
Did
be
everybody hear the
careful.
question?
Yeah.
Did everybody hear it?
So
Okay.
you have to be a little bit careful because sometimes, pardon me, sometimes you hear advocates say, "Oh, they're going to be so good at this or that," and the reality is you have to be careful. Someone I'm friendly with who left incarceration, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, and he got in touch with me and said, "Let me tell you to you straight." He had been a risk management executive, and he said, a lot of people who are in prison are bad bets because they take on too much risk. That's what got them in prison in the first place. So you have to be careful with what you're looking for. What I will tell you has really struck me is when you find the right people, the people who have made the true commitment to turn their life around, they have so much grit. You keep hearing the adjective grit, determination, ability to overcome obstacles. So in a generic sense, there's that. There seems to be some evidence that they can be good on certain kinds of sales. There's a nonprofit in California that is trying to create a talent pipeline of people from prison for tech sales. I'm not sure I would. I'd be careful about fiduciary sales and things like that, but for tech sales, because some of the people have learned how to hustle. But I will also add that, and this is the one that really surprised me. I came into this with 0 friends who had ever been incarcerated or had a felony conviction, and I don't think any with even a misdemeanor. I have lots of friends, and they are the most stand-up people I know because they have fallen so hard that they have picked themselves up and have to be just the most determined, steadfast human beings. So that's been something that's really enriched my life in just a wonderful way.
What I was interested in your question about what kind of security check is it?
So there's 2 things when you bring up the topic of security check. One can be regulatory barriers. So there are actually, so in the defense industry, typically you can't hire people with felony convictions. In the financial services industries, there are very narrow exemptions that are available for people with criminal records. Most records are or many records are disqualifying. But companies do background checks as a matter of course. It's part of the way that they select employees, but it's also part of the way that they have to build a barrier or build protection or a harbor against negligent hiring liability. For the potential that they're sued, they have to show they've done a process. So they will do different kinds of checks. I'm working actually with several prominent companies in the background check industry who are trying to make sure that background checks aren't abused and aren't overly exclusionary. So part of the decision is how far back do you go? You go back to age 18 for a 50-year-old? Boy, that kind of stinks, right? Or should you just go back, best practices, like 5 or 7 years? Do you screen for every type of potential record or only those that are relevant for the job? So there's ways that you can approach this. And then the critical, frankly, the most important part of the screening is not what the background check says. It's who in HR is examining that to give a green light or a red light. And all too often, this is where it fails in corporate America. CEO says, we're fair chance hire employers. But what happens is when it gets down to that background check coming back, the person who has to make the decision says, this is a no-win situation for me. I'm always going to say no because there's nothing in it for me to say yes. And so that becomes, to my mind, that's the most significant part of the background check. Yes.
Does racism come into play because the vast majority of the incarcerated are
So I have no doubt that race plays a role in criminal justice. However, I think it's probably secondary to poverty and class. And so there is a role there. There's actually, the statistics are a little bit different for federal and state prison, but it is disproportionately people of color, but it's about 50% whites in prison. It's been a moving target with COVID and things like that. But the real issue becomes uh, the majority of people who go into prison are young, poor men, and who are often inadequately represented, as well as, I'm not saying there's not guilt. There absolutely typically is. I know there are miscarriages of justice, but a big factor, and this has been documented well by John Foreman at Yale, John Pfaff at Fordham University has done work on it's prosecutors who advance their careers by getting as many felony convictions as they can. I'll give you a quick real life example. My friend Daniel Doherty, he and I are co-authoring a piece. He was imprisoned at age 18 for stealing an MP3 player. And the state's attorney in the county of Los Angeles could have charged this as a misdemeanor, but prosecutors, once upon a time, and still in many cases, are judged how many felony convictions did you get? So he charged it as a felony, and he told this poor young man who came from a home filled with substance abuse. He said, "You have a choice. It's a felony. That's a 5-year sentence. But if you plead guilty right now, it's a 2-year sentence." So 95% of convictions never went through a court. They were plea bargains. And so that's a system that is open to abuse. The Cato Institute has done really good work on this. It's a system that's open to abuse of poor, unsophisticated young people.
One interesting thing we have with the experience with this is that I founded a entrepreneurship in Mexico in the lower class. And the idea was to so-called upper class. It never going to hire them no matter what education they had. For anything other than the media work. And so my position was, well, that's fine. Go and visit for yourself. I'm not talking about cartel people or anything like
Right.
that, but dealers are extremely savvy and probably excellent.
Yeah, no, there's absolutely some strong entrepreneurial instincts, which is good. The challenge is that when you think of entrepreneurs, most successful entrepreneurs in this country started in their 50s, 40s, and 50s, right? They already had financial capital and social capital critically. They knew how to do this. This population doesn't. That being said, there's some wonderful nonprofits that work in the space. Some of you may have heard of Defy Ventures. It's one of the early ones, and I actually just had a Zoom call with their CEO last week, Andrew Glazer, and they're in many states. And Andrew and I were talking, and we both acknowledge that the training is really good. He thinks of it as you help create intrapreneurs, people who understand the business owner's standpoint. Some will be entrepreneurs, but not everyone will. And I gave him from my old sales day as sell the sizzle, not the steak. And so the sizzle is entrepreneurship, but that really good training and work you do is the steak. Yes. Excellent questions. So there are increasingly, you're seeing safe harbors being built for employers to do this. and they have shown some success. Texas has actually been a leader in this, and it's been modeled by other states. So for certain convictions, if you hire someone who with a track record of certain convictions, that can't be held against them in a negligent hiring lawsuit. Another thing that's really good, it doesn't kick in till years after conviction, but for people who have come out and don't reoffend for a certain period of time, there are what are called clean slate laws. And I'm a big believer in those. It's essentially record sealing. Law enforcement can still have access to this, but it won't show up on a background check. And the only, it's very good, but it's incomplete because the problem is most reoffending happens in the first couple of years because you can't get a job. And these clean slate protections, the expungements or the sealing of records, usually doesn't kick in for 5 years, 7 years. It depends on the state and specific crimes and things like that. So it's a very good law. It only corresponds to certain crimes, so to what we tend to be less worried about. And it's a step in the right direction for sure.
So one of the things that I really liked about your book are case studies, because those are stories. And I thought maybe you could talk about the Dan Meyer case, that sort of aha moment about social workers versus HR and that, because I think that kind of ties in with what we're talking about.
The book is meant to be very practical, and everything I learned from people who've actually done this successfully. And it's not an academic exercise. And I started, as soon as I had identified the problem around 2013, 2014, and in 2015, I started seeking out companies that were doing this. And first, by accident, I walked into a nonprofit restaurant in Charlotte that does this. And then one of my colleagues said, "You must know about this place called Nehemiah Manufacturing." I said, "I've never heard of them." We banked them at the time, and so I got an introduction to the CEO, Dan Meyer, absolute visionary, career in consumer products manufacturing in Cincinnati, worked for Procter & Gamble, had his own firm, sold his firm, and decided to do another consumer products manufacturing company. And he thought he would locate it in one of the troubled neighborhoods of Cincinnati. Cincinnati has some very neighborhoods of very deep poverty and challenges, and but he wasn't hiring people with convictions because he had never done that. And a nonprofit approached him and said, "Could you hire this person?" Tried, didn't work out. But he was puzzled and started getting into it. And then somewhere along the early stages, I think their 7th employee was someone with a felony conviction. Maybe that one did work out, but subsequent ones didn't. He hired a social worker. And when I met him back in 2015, he said, "I don't have HR people, I have 3 social workers." And I thought, ha, 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 cute. And he was like, "No, really, I have social workers." And what he has taught the American business community, he's been widely recognized. Harvard Business School did a case study that they did in 2018, published in 2020. It's required reading for all Harvard MBA candidates now, and he's also doing it at Stanford Business School. What he has taught the American business community is to make this work, it's not just finding the person who's ready, it's making sure they are equipped to succeed. And what people coming out of deep poverty with the additional burdens of criminal records need to succeed is very different than what we might have needed to succeed. It might be access to transportation. It might be people walking out of prison with enormous debts that become too great a burden. So he actually refers them to credit relief agencies that help work that down or eliminate it. He's made micro loans to employees. A car breaks down, that's their only way of getting to work. They don't have $300 in the bank. They don't have a credit card. He's even gotten into health. And this is a for-profit company. And he has such good profitability because his employees are incredibly loyal. Today, they have 220 employees, 150 are second chance employees. And beautiful factory. He says it's a family. They every August they stuff backpacks for the kids of employees. Give them school supplies. But he doesn't lose employees often. And in that business, that's a big cost of doing business. So he has highly engaged, loyal employees. So that's my Dan Meyer. And when I sat down with him, this was the first for-profit I sat down with. I'd sat down with nonprofit social enterprises, and he's a Wharton guy, so he started talking numbers, I started talking numbers, and we both had our mutual aha moment. And
Yeah.
we've been to the White House together and things like that. So he's a
That's
great
neat.
guy.
Yeah. And I think if I'm right in that case study, also he talked about the whole family, so not just the person, but sort of caring for
Yes.
their family.
Yeah. So there's a lot of stress when you are living on the margin and have no family resources. You are under a whole lot of stress, and he works on that with his social workers and with partnerships critical to all of the really good employers as they partner with nonprofits, because businesses only have so much expertise, and the nonprofits might be helping with childcare issues. They might be dealing with access to food. So Dan worked with a local food pantry to stay open one night a week, so his employees could go to the food pantry after hours, and things like that. So it really needs a lot more support, and one of the critical supports is mentoring. How did we all learn how to dress appropriately for a job, that you're supposed to show up on time, not just every once in a while, but every day, that if your car breaks down, you should call. If you come from multi-generational unemployment, you don't know those things. And it's not that you're not willing to learn them, but somewhere along the way, someone has to tell you, and you also have to have enough of a relationship of trust with your employer that you can tell them things that are going on. And that is hard for the typical business employer to wrap their arms around.
So are the mentors then other employees?
In that case, they have enough critical mass that you see some of that. That's what the social workers help with quite a bit.
Right.
It depends on the company. I actually devote a whole chapter to a company called JBM Manufacturing, and they hired a life coach, and they have, in fact, the appendices of the book are documents, including coaching documents that this company uses. And to your point of case studies, this is I guess the part of the book I'm the most proud of. I think it was May of 2020, so in the middle of COVID, I'm flying out to Ohio, trying to find hotels that are open and restaurants are open. It was a very odd time, but this factory was open because they were in essential industry. And they had come to second chance hiring not because of any kind of ethical motivation, though they certainly get it, but because they tried everything else and couldn't get employees. They were in a county seat of a semi-rural county, and everyone hated the idea. The CEO bought the company from his father, who founded it. They make envelopes, and his father thought he was crazy, but he still pressed ahead. And today, a third of their about 150 employees are second chance. It's transformed the whole company and the company culture. They opened a second facility, not in their rural county, but in inner city Cincinnati, not far from Nehemiah.
Yeah.
And they have 20 workers there right now who I think are all second chance because they know how to tap that talent pool. Think how transformational that would be for New Haven and Bridgeport and Hartford and all these cities that have lost industry and good paying jobs. But one of the things they did as well that I love is they ended up setting up a training program in prison. With a paid stipend. They don't produce product there. They don't want to be perceived as prison manufacturers. But one of their former employees was arrested, was in a prison. They said, well, there's our trainer. So they worked with the Ohio Department of Corrections, had him transferred to the prison they knew had the appropriate HVAC infrastructure, donated a folding machine for envelopes, and they train people, and when they come out, they have skilled workers, among many other things that they've done.
Yeah.
So with business audiences, I always tell people, you don't have to read the whole thing. Just go to page 145, chapter 6. Read about this company. If that doesn't get you going back to page 1, that's okay. So,
yeah, the examples you were giving reminded me of, I don't know the exact name, but businessman in Ray, who had an employee who lost his job and was sent back to prison just because previously on the parking ticket.
yes, yeah.
That made me wonder, Ray set up some special program.
Yeah.
But what are the opportunities that are missing right now for collaboration between government and the business? Because this is really no cost to the government.
Yeah.
In fact, they wind up losing because
So Ray Dalton is one of the companies I profiled. He was a serial entrepreneur. He was the Amazon of hospital equipment parts. He had an online catalog of this and sold the company for quite a bit. But he's always been a second chance employer, and he had a very good, and it does it absolutely right. And he had a very good support system, good track record. But one day, one of his good employees just didn't show up, didn't answer his cell phone. So finally, after a few days, they drove by his house, and his wife was there. He went back to prison. He had unpaid traffic and parking fines that had accumulated while he was in prison and had just gone up and up and up. And he didn't have the money, and so that was a violation. There's another example that I give in the book, and this is a terrible one. A employee, CEO in Indianapolis told me he hired a guy, gave him a chance. He was a great employee, a construction firm. He liked him so much that he tapped him to be part of a team to go for an out-of-state job. This employee was so eager to please the guy who had given him a chance, he didn't tell him that was a violation of his parole terms. He wasn't allowed to leave the state. And so it got caught, violated, and back in prison. And so to your question about government is getting better at this very slowly. So in Ohio, for instance, there's much more of a look about, first of all, getting people paperwork. So if your license expired and you don't have ID, which makes it really hard, there's no need to wait till someone's out the prison gates. Do that while you're in prison so they're better prepared. So you're seeing some of that. I think fines is an area that has not been adequately addressed. One of the problems we have in the United States, or one of the challenges to this work, is we don't have a justice system. We have 50 state justice systems, a federal justice system, a military justice system, and they all operate under different rules. And so there's not necessarily consistency. And then when you're dealing with parole and probation officers, some of them are fabulous and some of them stink. And that can be challenging. So one of the things that employers learn to do is when they hire people, develop a relationship with the parole officer, and even either offer flex time to meet with the parole officer, have them come to the facility, particularly if they have multiple clients of that parole officer. By the way, you have to pay. If you're on parole, you have to pay to meet with your parole officer, typically. So you're taking poor people who may have struggling with everything, and you're adding to those burdens. I would say if the business community truly understood how we are treating their workforce, their current and future workforce, the justice, we'd never stand for it. We'd be all over justice reform. And I think that the business community is starting to get a handle that something's not quite right.
Have you seen the situation where thousands apply their social workers to?
Not directly. There are a number of employers who've learned how to work with government employees in these areas. Often nonprofits just seem to be a little bit more flexible or better intermediaries in helping tap those resources. What I think is an opportunity for the future is for states and municipalities to do more second chance hiring. They have not done a lot of it, and there's a growth opportunity. I always think there's an analogy to the way that for African Americans, civil service was a pathway to the middle class when other pathways were shut off. There are a couple of good examples. The most notable one that I've come across is in Chicago. The Chicago Transit Authority has a second chance program. They have put 1,000 people through the program. They've hired 350 of them. They partner with nonprofits. They do it the right way. They started with just the people who cleaned the trains and the buses overnight and realized, wow, there's talent here. And so they have a great diesel mechanic training program as well. So every state should be doing that.
So one thing that's interesting, as you explained in some of the case stories, is that the creation of an ecosystem to some extent is what the most successful people do.
Yes.
So being able to fill in the gaps that exist currently with Black communities, the lack of a stable ecosystem that is looking not only directly within the company, everything and anything that has been the families and
Yep.
social systems and the government systems. And I think that's really a model that can be used Hoffman Foundation.
Yes.
That I work with. They have, I mean, they're right now, their big push is to look at how do you create entrepreneurial ecosystem. People use those words, but there really is a much greater sort of definition and approach to that. And what you just explained is the creation of a
So I don't know what's in the water in Kansas City, where Kaufman is located, is based, of course. But the Kansas City, the Greater Kansas City Regional Chamber of Commerce has been one of the best chambers of commerce in the country for driving what they call smart justice, which is trying to educate. The problem is when you think about this huge ecosystem, there's so many issues, and for a lot of businesses, that's just too much complexity. Even though they know that they don't have to do it themselves. I always tell businesses it's a continuity, it's a continuum, right? You can say, I only want to consider the people who are already stable, at least to start, and that's absolutely viable. And then, frankly, what happens is they reach a little more, and they reach a little more, and next thing you know, they've got a full-blown second chance support program. But you don't have to start with the most complex challenges. You can start with people who had a conviction 20 years ago, and yet no disrespect to HR departments, but your HR department is chucking that resume to the bottom no matter what they've done in the intervening years. And so there's a lot of improvement we can do, because it's not just about giving people a job, it's about giving them this economic mobility to switch jobs so that they can contribute more and more to the economy and to their own financial situation.
So does that mean the HR departments have to change then?
Yes, and there's good leadership in the HR leadership industry. The SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management, has led the way with a Getting Talent Back to Work program. They offer a certificate, a training program, and for an organization that 300,000 members globally, for an organization that gets paid by membership dues and paid for training certifications, they've made this available to non-members, and they've made it free. So I think that's a wonderful commitment from their leadership.
Yeah.
Johnny Taylor, the CEO of was one of the people who endorsed my book too on the back cover. So I'm very grateful.
Yeah.
But there are people who, HR professionals have been very honest with me. They've said, we were always taught not to go there. And frankly, I don't blame them if the CEO or their supervisor, if something goes wrong, is going to say, why'd you hire that person? So one of the critical ingredients to success is that the leadership has to come from the top. There has to be a direct message that says, we are going to do this as a company, and mistakes may happen, and we're not going to hold you against you. In fact, if you're not taking chances, we'll hold that against you.
Is the privatization of prisons
It's overblown. It's really not an issue. And
not an issue?
It's
Okay.
in terms of this. It's
Yeah.
maybe 7% of the prison population is in privately owned,
Oh, that's small.
and they are neither better nor worse. There's a book, I can't think of the author, who went behind it, was a prison guard at a private facility and talked about how awful it was. Well, public prisons are awful too. Prisons are awful places as a general rule.
Yeah.
I have friends who have been in both and have said, I actually had a better experience at the private prison. I think they're both kind of about the same. There have been some formal studies done, and on a 10-point scale, 10 points, they did find that private prisons outperformed on 4, public outperformed on 6, but it's things like contraband, like cell phones and things like that, was worse in private prisons. There was more contraband, but there were fewer sexual assaults. I'm not sure I weight those equally. So I would just say prisons are, broadly speaking, not great places. It doesn't matter who's running them, but there are some prisons which are becoming great places. State of Michigan has done a really good job. There's something going on in Connecticut. I attended a lecture given by the warden. They're trying to model a Connecticut prison after the German prison system and trying to make them truly places of rehabilitation. And I don't know how it's going. I haven't heard anything since. COVID's disrupted everything in the prison world, but I thought that was um, a wonderful example of where we have to go.
So what about the German prison? What makes it work?
There appears to be a greater focus on uh, basic human dignity in terms of the conditions and in terms of rehabilitation. You have to be really careful. It's not my area of expertise, not even close. And I do know that you have to be careful with the statistics. I'm a numbers guy. And there's been some very good papers out that show you can't compare recidivism rates in the United States to in Europe because each country measures them differently. When you see citations here for our high rate of recidivism, it's mostly based on a very extensive study that counts rearrests. So that's not really a good measure because you're capturing people who might be innocent. It might be, someone did time for a very serious crime, but was rearrested for a very minor misdemeanor, and it's all counted in. Many European countries will only count it if it's the same nature of crime, or if it is not just a rearrest, but actual reconviction and reincarceration. So you don't necessarily know. But I think it's fair to say that the Scandinavian countries seem to be doing a better job. But until I see the numbers and understand the numbers, I can't tell you much about that.
So what one question would you like to be asked that you haven't been asked? Just a little pressure,
You could ask about which party has supported this, or whether we can go really tough.
Oh, okay.
And the answer is, this is one of the incredibly rare areas where, positioned right, we have bipartisan agreement.
Wow. Yeah.
Because this speaks, I think, to who we are as Americans. I'm the son and grandson of immigrants. This was the land of opportunity for my family. We had a second chance to build here. I want everyone to have a second chance. One second chance employer I met in Florida the other week said, everyone deserves a mulligan. And if we're really going to be the land of opportunity, that has to include people who've made mistakes, but who've also paid their dues for those mistakes. And we get that on both sides of the aisles. I'm working on a project with my friend John Kupos, who's a wonderful, wonderful justice reformer. He's been in the Trump White House. He was in the helping work with them. He's worked with the Biden White House. He worked with the Obama White House. And people can agree on this. We might emphasize different solutions, but we agree on the end goal, and that's a wonderful thing. And it's been very moving to see that there's still something we can agree on.
We arrived a little late, but I was interested to hear what brought you into this field, because I know you had a prior career in big business.
Oh, I still have that job.
All right.
So I mentioned the economics of the labor market, right? So I've always paid attention. One thing I didn't mention is going back to 1980s, late 80s, I started looking at demographics as a driver of markets and economic factors, and it really is an important one. And so could see the labor shortage was eventually going to come, and started seeing it in different pockets of the country already. And it started with understanding the weight that the opioid epidemic was causing on the workforce. And once your eyes are open to the way that social ills can become economic issues, you can't unsee that. And then, boy, from opioid epidemic to justice involvement is a pretty short and direct path. I actually started in Kentucky. I was in Lexington, Kentucky at a breakfast, and manufacturing CEOs were these round tables I do, and they brought up labor shortage, can't find people who can pass the drug test. And at the time, 2013, I said, so what was it, pot? And everyone looked at me like I was crazy and said, pills. I said, what do you mean pills? First I had heard of the opioid problem, and we started looking into it, and it became obvious this is an economic issue, as well as terrible, tragic social issue. So it got me going, and then the rest is I hope, history.
Any other things you want to add, Jeff, about just about how what the resistance is with companies and sort of how
Sure.
we help them kind
Yeah.
of come around the bend
So,
here?
one of the reasons I wrote the book was to enable CEOs. If you get me in front of a room of 100 CEOs, which is part of what I do for my day job, typically, I can get them interested, and I can know that a certain percentage of those CEOs are going to walk out and say, we should try this. But what I found was they got ground down by inertia.
Yeah.
And that's one of the big problems. I actually, a CEO of a company based in Cleveland, it's got, I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 employees, a big company in multiple states. He was a deep believer in this. His father had actually been a mafioso who'd been incarcerated, and Charles Colson was his personal minister, Chuck Colson, and so his son said, "Wow, my dad became a good guy because of Chuck Colson," and so he converted to become an evangelical Christian. They felt this was a big part of his duty to offer second chance hiring, and he got so much pushback from his head of HR and his chief legal officer. They said that's your religion thing, doesn't belong in the workplace. He fired them both, and he asked me to come in and talk to the new team. I brought Dan Meyer from Nehemiah Manufacturing, very kindly drove the 4.5 hours up, spent the night, wouldn't even take the hotel room for free because he was so mission driven and wanted to talk with the CEO. The new team was much more receptive, and they're continue to build along. So it's getting through that inertia, and one of the ways you get through the inertia is the CEOs will typically be will hear this and get it. They'll have a vision, but they need ammunition to push through, and they need more role models. So there's things like the Second Chance Business Coalition is getting some prominence. It's co-chaired by Craig Arnold, who is the CEO of Eaton Corp, it's a power management company, and Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. So prominent business leaders. There's a whole host of brand name companies that are part of this. The more you hear about that, I think the better off. But the big driver right now is the labor shortage. So Amazon will do it. It's usually a local decision, and it's haphazard in terms of their implementation. So I've heard very mixed reports. Some are great. From what I can tell, they have not had a corporate directive about let's do it the right way. I'll tell you, there are others, like UPS seems to be doing it the right way. I'm impressed. McDonald's doesn't talk about this, but they've been de facto doing it by reaching into under-resourced areas. They partner with nonprofits. I think it's 30 cities, or it was 30 cities last I spoke to them. So there's a lot of great companies that are doing this. You just don't realize it. And most of them don't want to wear it on their sleeve. They're worried. I don't know if you've seen in the grocery store, Dave's Killer Bread, which is a national bakery. They're very proud of this. This is part of who they are. They advertise it. But most companies stay pretty quiet on it.
So what's the story of Dave's Killer Bread? I buy it. It's great, but I don't know.
So I believe Dave was a family member of the founder who got jammed up somehow, came back, joined the family company. I may have this wrong, but they ended up being a major second chance employer. They started the Dave's Killer Bread Foundation. I've collaborated with them, and wonderful people just to support this. So the companies that going on this come to love it, and it tends to help define the company. When you believe in truly inclusive employment, that's opens your eyes, and you start to want this not just for your company, but for every company. And they've been very supportive.
It was identified sweet spot in marketing areas by industry, by company size.
It's a great question. I think the path of least resistance tends to be manufacturing. because it's got a severe labor shortage because from 2000 to 2010 we lost so many manufacturing jobs that no one entered the field, and every parent learned to tell a kid don't go into manufacturing, and so they've got this big gap that they're trying hard to fill. So they're interested, but it also helps overcome some of the objections. If you're in manufacturing, you're not facing a customer typically, you're not handling money, and the wages in manufacturing are good enough. It's a living wage, so people who have these financial burdens can work through them. So that's been a really good one. But it's in terms of company size, middle market companies, 100 to a couple thousand seems to be the sweet spot, largely because I think the marker, maybe you need a certain critical mass to do this right. But the other factor is those companies tend to be family owned and benevolent dictatorships. And so one person has to make the decision. Fortune 500 companies are tough. Some of them, as I mentioned, are doing it, but boy, it takes them a long time. I've been approached by a couple of them. I've had conversations, and they look at what I think should be a 6-month process. They look at as to get a pilot up and running. They look at it as a multi-year process, just because how they operate. So I'd say 100 to 5,000 employees, family owned. Interestingly, CEOs come to this often out of personal conviction for some reason. Disproportionate number of evangelical Christian CEOs get involved in this. That's not the only path people find, but that's often a path. So it's been that's not my personal background, so it's been a lot of exposure to American cultures that are new to me. Very rewarding.
So my last question, because we're in a library, is what's your favorite books on the topic other than your own?
So I hired, when I started on this project, and I hired a literary attorney in Chicago, kind of focuses on, you have an idea for a socially worthy book, we'll help you get it published. And he was excellent. I got 3 offers from 3 publishing houses and ended up with HarperCollins, very good one, obviously. But part of it is he has to do a search. Is who else has written books like this? There is no other book like this. And the second book like this will be my book with Daniel, my co-author Daniel. So there's really nothing. I think the justice system books that are out there, John Foreman's Locking Up Our Own, which talks about the race issue and mass incarceration, was fully supported by the African American community at the time, because and you're seeing some of that today as cities become less safe. Is an important book. John Pfaff's book about what drove this in terms of prosecutorial personal motivations, I think are important books. But I'll be honest with you, I don't read a lot of books in this space because I spend so much time on it.
Yeah.
I'm in a book club. We read all sorts of other books. And I'm happy to do so.
Oh, good. What do you like, Just Mercy? Did you?
Oh, I thought it was excellent.
Yeah,
Excellent movie. And Hollywood can help with this. And there's some campaigns to do this. The entertainment industry is a huge industry. And they hire a lot of people. They should all be having internships and training programs. I think they'll get there. They're not there yet. There's some prominent people in Hollywood. I was on the board of the Harris Theater for Music and Dance in Chicago, kind of the Kennedy Center for Chicago. And they heard when I was interviewing for the board seat, they asked about my passions, and this came up. And the CEO, I give her enormous credit, said, we can do that. You're an employer. And they actually hired 2 people. They partnered with a nonprofit. They did it the right way. They had a very good program. So, everyone can be doing this.
Yeah. Great. Well, big thanks. Oops. Yes, Carla.
So the next book project is meant to be, I got part of the feedback I've gotten on this is a great book for the CEOs because it has that sort of big picture story. I talk about culture. I talk about the history of the legal system with regard to this and why we are where we are. And I talk about policy. But when your CEO says, let's do this, and I'm holding you accountable, I have a chapter on implementation, but you need a book on implementation. And part of the book has to be, there's a lot of nonprofits that are doing excellent work that have sort of come up with checklists. Here's what you have to do, but they don't tell you how to do it. And I was very fortunate in one of my previous jobs in Wall Street. I worked for a guy, and he was coaching me for my next position. He ultimately ran the private client group for Morgan Stanley, and he would coach me. We'd have these formal coaching sessions. I said, for this next job, suppose this happens. And he would always answer by saying, if it were me, this is what I would say. And he would give me the exact words that I would get to use later on. And so part of this next book is, we don't know if it's going to be second chance hiring for dummies or what we're going to call it, but it'll be very practical. It will be something you don't have to read through and through. It'll have a reference. If this is your problem, here's what you read. And I'm really proud of my co-author, Daniel Gart. So Daniel's the gentleman who was incarcerated at age 18 for the MP3 player. When he got out, by the way, someone somewhere along the way said, you don't have to let this define you. And he might have been living on Skid Row at the time. And this person said, what do you want to do? And Daniel said, well, I always wanted to start a rock band. I could sing and I can write songs. So the guy says, so go start a rock band. So he finds a guitar player. Then he gets a gig, but now he needs a band, not just a guitar player. And so he finds a bass player and a drummer. 4 albums and a gold record later, touring the world, and just an amazing creative guy. He's done work with the UN, the World Economic Forum. He's been like some kind of like de facto peace ambassador in North Africa. He's a really interesting guy. And so Daniel was one of the people who I got to know, and he pestered me. He said, you need a different kind of book. So I finally said, okay, you're the co-author, and we're working on that project right now.
So big thank you to Jeff.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming.
And he'll be in the back, and you can pick up a copy of Untapped Talent.
Here or there?
Right in the back.
Right in the back, and so.